The first time the alien queen insulted Paul Larkins and his dog, it was broadcast live to 17 planets. It happened on the diplomatic platform orbiting Irixel 5 during what was supposed to be a standard agreement renewal between Earth and the Threx Dominion. The Earth delegation, dressed in pressed navy blue uniforms with small badges of the UN and ESA, stood quietly in the center of the chamber while the towering queen of Threx, Virilax, loomed at the far end of the room behind a gleaming obsidian dais. Paul wasn't even supposed to be there. He was a civilian contractor and engineer assigned to a mining project on the asteroid colonies. He'd only come to Irixel 5 to deliver a replacement part for a damaged atmospheric regulator. But his ship got flagged for random inspection, and he was rerouted to the station for a thorough customs review. It was a load of bureaucracy, and worse, it meant he had to bring Max, his German shepherd, along for the wait. Max wasn't a small dog. Nor was he particularly fond of alien environments, especially ones with flickering overhead lights and that faint smell of burnt plastic and antiseptic that clung to the station's air. Paul tried to keep him calm with a sequence of whispered reassurances, but Max was tense, tail stiff, golden eyes locked on the Threx guards lining the chamber. Why is there a quadruped animal present in a diplomatic chamber? Queen Virilax's voice echoed, deep and metallic. Her translator unit rendered her speech in clipped English, and despite the mechanical distortion, the disdain was impossible to miss. She pointed one long, pale digit toward Max. This creature is unsanitary. It drools, pants. It lacks higher consciousness. It should be caged. Paul stiffened. The room went quiet. Earth's delegation leader, Ambassador Reeves, cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward Paul, trying to signal him to stay calm. But Paul had already stepped forward. "With all due respect, Your Majesty," he said. "That creature's name is Max, and he's saved more lives than most of the diplomats in this room." The translator buzzed, and the Threx queen narrowed her black, reflective eyes. "Bold words for a species that still uses combustion engines," she said. Max let out a low growl. Paul placed a hand on the dog's back, gently, but didn't back down. "He's trained for search and rescue," Paul said. "Pulled 6 people out of a collapsed lunar mining shaft after a quake. He's got more discipline than half the crew on this station. And I don't care how many galaxies you rule, if you insult him again, you're insulting me." Virilax blinked twice. Then, in full view of 17 planetary broadcasts, she tilted her head and said, "Then I insult you both. You are a small, soft, inefficient species. Your companion is a beast. Your reaction proves my point." Paul didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Max, who looked back with his usual steady calm. Then Paul did something that would be replayed in news cycles for weeks. He pulled a dog biscuit from his breast pocket, knelt down, and held it out for Max. "You want to know what makes us special, Your Majesty?" he said without looking up. "We take care of each other, even when it's hard. Even when someone with a crown and a fancy title tells us not to bother." Max took the biscuit gently. The silence in the chamber was so complete you could hear the faint hum of the air recycler behind the Queen's dais. Then the alarms started blaring. Red lights flashed across the chamber ceiling. One of the Threx guards barked something in their own language, and a panel on the eastern wall slid open, revealing a monitor. A freighter inbound from Raxum's belt had lost power and was on a collision course with the station's outer ring. "Impact in 2 minutes," said the automated voice. "Outer ring modules 30 through 35 may be compromised." Paul's heart skipped. Max was already standing, ears perked. That's where the customs hold was. His ship and all his tools were docked at Module 32. One of the Earth aides grabbed Paul's arm. "We have to get to the central spire. Emergency bulkheads will seal in 20 seconds. Paul pulled free. "My dog's the only reason I'm still alive after that lunar shaft collapse. I'm not leaving him behind. No one asked you to. He's still registered in the customs hold. If the system seals him in, he's done." Queen Virilax's expression didn't change. If your companion lacks the intelligence to evacuate, that is nature's judgment. Paul didn't answer. He ran. He sprinted through the corridor with Max at his side, boots pounding against the metal floor. The station's internal lights flickered as the emergency systems rerouted power. Overhead, warning klaxons screamed. He turned sharply down a stairwell, slid under a half-closed blast door, and raced toward the customs wing. By the time he reached Module 32, the outer bulkhead was already beginning its descent. A station tech shouted from behind the control panel. "You can't go in there." Paul didn't stop. He dove through the threshold just before the blast door sealed behind him. Inside the customs bay, the temperature had already dropped. The ship was visible through the docking viewport, floating dead in space, its nose crumpled from debris impact. Max was circling near the central column where his leash had been clipped earlier. Paul unclipped him, grabbed the emergency override key from the wall panel, and punched it into the docking clamp release. The chamber shook as the freighter struck the station. Paul slammed into the wall. His shoulder cracked hard against the metal, and he let out a sharp cry. His vision blurred. Max barked, frantic, pawing at him. He tried to stand. Pain shot through his right arm. He cradled it against his side and staggered over to the nearest access panel. The ship was listing, smoke beginning to seep from the far side of the customs wing. He pressed the intercom button. "This is Paul Larkins," he said, breath ragged. "I've got Max. We need evac at Module 32. I think my collarbone's broken." Static answered. He collapsed beside Max and tried to stay conscious. The dog lay next to him, head resting on Paul's knee. 15 minutes passed before the emergency crew cut through the sealed blast door. When they finally reached him, Paul was pale, barely upright, and his right arm was useless. Max didn't leave his side, even as the medics loaded Paul onto the stretcher. Back on the command deck, Queen Virilax watched the footage without expression. "He risked his life for an animal," one of her aides said. The Queen's gaze remained fixed on the screen. "No, he risked it for family." Paul spent the next 3 days in the medical bay. The fracture was confirmed with a skin-clean break to the clavicle, moderate trauma to the surrounding tissue. He was lucky. A few more seconds and the fire suppression system would have triggered a full lockdown. When he woke, Max was on the floor beside his bed, tail wagging gently. "You shouldn't be here," Paul whispered. Max tilted his head. A nurse stepped in. He wouldn't leave. Laid down outside the door and growled at anyone who came too close. Paul smiled, then winced as the movement tugged at his shoulder. On the 4th day, a message arrived. Queen Virilax requested a private audience. Paul looked at the nurse. "You sure it's not a prank?" "No prank. She's waiting in the observation dome." Paul got dressed slowly. Painkillers dulled the worst of it, but every movement reminded him of the break. He walked with Max beside him, careful not to jostle his shoulder. Virilax stood alone at the center of the dome, gazing out at the stars. "You wanted to see me?" Paul asked. She turned. "I misjudged your species." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Because I almost got myself killed saving my dog?" "No," she said. "Because you didn't hesitate." There was a long pause. "I insulted you," she said, "and your companion. My words were intended to provoke. I have ruled the Threx Dominion for over 6 centuries. I have witnessed countless species. Most respond to offense with posturing or violence. You responded with loyalty." Paul shifted, wincing. "I didn't do it for you." "I know," she said. "That is why it matters." She reached into a compartment at her side and held out a small metal disc. "This is a Dominion reconciliation token. It is rarely given. It signifies that an apology has been made." Paul took it. "I've never had a galactic apology before," he muttered. "Then you are fortunate," Virilax said. "Most species never receive one." He looked at Max, who sat calmly at his side, then back at the Queen. "Do me a favor," Paul said. "Next time, don't judge before you understand." "I will remember," she said. As he turned to leave, she added, "And tell your companion. He is not a beast. He is formidable." Paul chuckled. "Yeah," he said. "He is." By the time Paul was cleared to leave the medical bay, the incident had already turned into a diplomatic legend. He stepped into the corridor with Max trotting beside him, his shoulder stiff in a polymer brace and his hospital-issued shirt hanging loosely over the bandages. The station's curved walls buzzed with quiet energy, as if the metal itself was whispering about him. Two Threx engineers paused mid-conversation as he passed. One tilted their triangular head and made a clicking sound that might have been respectful or mildly confused. Paul wasn't sure. He gave a half-wave and kept walking, trying to ignore the way they kept glancing at Max like he might suddenly sprout wings. "You're becoming a bit of a celebrity," said a voice from behind. He turned slightly carefully and saw Ambassador Reeves approaching from a side corridor, hands tucked behind his back, suit freshly pressed and not a hair out of place. "I didn't ask for that. Most people don't. But saving a sentient during a station emergency tends to make headlines. Even if that sentient has 4 legs and a tail." Paul frowned. "I didn't do it for attention." "I know," Reeves said. "That's the problem." They walked in silence for a bit, Max padding between them. The corridor curved upward toward the observation deck, where Earth's delegation quarters were temporarily housed. The artificial gravity hummed beneath their feet. Reeves glanced sideways. "You've been requested to attend a ceremonial forum tomorrow." Paul blinked. "A what? Ceremonial forum?" "It's a diplomatic formality. Recognition of significant interspecies events. Usually involves a speech, some symbolic gifts, and awkward applause." "I'm just trying to get back to my ship." "Your ship's undergoing inspection," Reeves said. "And before you ask, no, that's not standard. The Threx are meticulous and a little curious." Paul stopped walking. "You think they're poking around because of Max?" "I think," Reeves said slowly, "your actions disrupted their assumptions. You didn't posture. You didn't bargain. You didn't even hesitate. That's not something they know how to categorize." Paul stared at the floor. "I didn't do anything special." Reeves shrugged. "That's what makes it special." He left Paul at the entrance to the delegation wing, nodding once before disappearing into the lift. Paul stepped inside and the doors hissed shut behind him. The room smelled like citrus and sterilizer. Max sniffed the corners with cautious curiosity before settling on a cushioned bench near the window. Paul sat gingerly across from him, easing his bad arm onto a padded support. The brace itched near the collarbone, but the medics had warned him not to tamper with it. Even a small adjustment could throw off the bone alignment. Outside the window, the gas giant loomed in shades of blue and violet, its ring system casting a gentle shimmer across the station's hull. Paul leaned back and closed his eyes. He must have dozed off because the next thing he heard was the soft chime of the door. He sat up too fast and immediately regretted it. His shoulder throbbed in protest. A Threx entered without speaking. They were shorter than most, with a silver crest along the top of their head and a robe made of interwoven glass fibers that caught the light. Paul rubbed his eyes. "Can I help you?" The Threx stepped forward and extended a thin object. "This is a neural mirroring scroll," they said. "It contains Queen Virilax's formal account of your actions. You may review it before the forum." Paul took it, surprised by how light it was. "I don't read Threxian. It translates through contact." He touched the surface, and a stream of symbols flickered into English. The phrasing was stiff, ceremonial, full of phrases like honor-bound deviation from protocol and unexpected demonstration of cross-species fidelity. He skimmed it, frowning. "This makes me sound like I planned everything." The Threx tilted its head. "Intention is less important than outcome." "That explains a lot," Paul muttered. Max yawned from the bench. The Threx watched the dog with unreadable eyes. "Your companion, does he understand speech?" "He understands tone. And food wrappers. But no, not language. Yet he followed you into danger." Paul looked at Max. "He always does." The Threx was quiet for a long moment. Then they said, "I was stationed during the Seldari Accords. A human negotiator once refused to leave a burning outpost until he confirmed all Seldari larvae were accounted for." Paul frowned. "That's oddly specific." "His name was Marcus Bell." He died minutes before rescue arrived. I've never heard of him. Most haven't. But the Seldari remember. The Threx turned and left without another word. The room was quiet again. Paul stared at the scroll, then set it down. Max watched him for a moment, then stood and placed his head gently on Paul's knee. You're gonna have to wear something tomorrow, Paul said. They probably won't let you show up in fur alone. Max sneezed once, unimpressed. The following morning, he was woken by a series of soft tones and a projected message hovering above the bed. The forum was scheduled for the third segment, roughly equivalent to late morning Earth time. He had 2 hours to prepare. A station assistant delivered a formal tunic with an embroidered UN insignia and a harness for Max that looked more ceremonial than functional. Paul dressed slowly, wincing as he maneuvered around the shoulder brace. The tunic's left side had been modified to accommodate it, but it still irritated the skin near his neck. Max tolerated the harness with minimal fuss, though he did paw at the decorative tassels until Paul tucked them under. They were escorted to the central forum chamber by a quartet of Threx attendants. The room had been transformed. A shallow pool of bioluminescent water circled the stage, reflecting soft amber light. Dozens of species filled the upper tiers, their eyes and sensory organs focused on the center. Queen Virilax stood on a raised platform, motionless. Paul was guided to a position opposite her, with Max seated beside him. The dog's ears twitched, but he remained still. Virilax raised one hand, and the chamber dimmed. The Threx Dominion recognizes the anomaly, she said. There was no preamble. Paul glanced at one of the attendants. She nodded slightly. It was his turn. He stepped forward, adjusted the mic, and tried not to shift his weight too much. I'm not great at speeches, he began. I fix things. Usually machines. Sometimes air systems. Occasionally a drilling rig that's been dropped into a crater. A low ripple of static laughter moved through the chamber. But this wasn't about fixing anything. This was about not leaving someone behind. Even if that someone can't talk. Even if it doesn't make strategic sense. Sometimes you just do the right thing because it's the right thing. He glanced down at Max. I don't expect anyone here to understand what it's like to grow up with an animal who knows exactly when you're about to cry. Or when you're angry. Or when you're lying to yourself about being fine. But that connection? That loyalty? That's not a glitch in our species. It's the best part of us. He stepped back. Max sat up straighter. Virilax remained silent for several seconds. Then she descended from the platform and approached Paul directly. The chamber fell silent. She extended a small, dark sphere. This is a bond node, she said. It records significant interspecies ties. Few exist. Fewer are offered. Paul hesitated, then accepted it. The chamber erupted in sound, not applause, not music, but a harmonic resonance that filled the space like warm water. Max barked once in response, and several delegates flinched. Later, as they left the chamber, Paul exhaled slowly. I feel like I just got adopted by an empire. Max wagged once. Let's not make this a habit, Paul said. Max barked again. Paul looked at the bond node in his hand and shook his head. Yeah, that's what I thought. 6 days had passed since the forum, and Paul's shoulder itched with the kind of persistence that only healing skin could muster. The brace kept his arm locked at a 90-degree angle, limiting him to slow, awkward movements. He'd learned to brush his teeth left-handed and had made peace with his shirts looking like he dressed in a wind tunnel. He sat in a quiet corner of the station's greenhouse dome, one leg stretched out across the bench, Max sprawled beside him like a furry sentry. The dome was humid but peaceful, filled with tall, spiraling stalks and translucent-leaved trees that filtered light through shifting colors. The scent reminded Paul of overripe kiwi and whetstone. It was the only place on the station where Earth-standard gravity wasn't enforced. The Threx preferred a softer pull, and Paul found the slight float in his steps oddly soothing. You've been avoiding the human wing, said a voice behind a patch of glowing orange vines. Paul didn't turn. Been enjoying the quiet. And the greenery. Ambassador Reeves emerged holding 2 sealed hydration bulbs. He handed one to Paul, who took a sip and winced. Still tastes like recycled melon water. Reeves sat with a sigh. The Threx believe flavor is a distraction. They've clearly never eaten a cheeseburger. Reeves chuckled under his breath and leaned back, eyes scanning the canopy. You've made quite an impression. The Dominion Council voted to classify Earth as a Tier 3 cooperative influence. That jumps us ahead of the Garvathi and the Dreen. Paul raised an eyebrow. From one guy and his dog? It's not the act, Reeves said. It's what it says about us. They've cataloged our weapons, our ships, our trade infrastructure. None of it moved the dial. But loyalty to a non-verbal creature during crisis? That unsettled them. Paul scratched at his temple. You say that like it's a good thing. It is. But it's also complicated. Max sat up, ears angled slightly as a faint chime sounded from the far end of the dome. A Threx technician entered, pushing a small levitating cart filled with nutrient gel packets for the plants. The technician paused when he saw Paul, then gave a shallow nod and tapped twice on the cart before continuing. Paul watched him go. They still look at me like I'm going to burst into flames. You bypassed every protocol in their emergency system. And you survived. That's not heroism to them. That's a bug in the rule set. I didn't do it to make a point. I know. That's what makes it harder for them to categorize. Paul took another sip of the bulb and grimaced again. So what now? They want to study Max. Paul's grip tightened slightly. Not happening. It's not invasive. Observation only. Behavioral logging. They're not asking for blood samples. They just want to understand how a creature like Max develops loyalty so complete it overrides self-preservation. Paul looked down at Max, who yawned and flopped over with a low grunt. He's not a lab rat. They're not treating him like one. In fact, Queen Virilax has assigned a xenobiologist to shadow you both for the next 2 days. Purely voluntary. But she's persistent. Paul sighed and leaned his head back against the bench. Let me guess. She's already on her way. She's been watching you through the greenhouse canopy for 20 minutes. Paul didn't look up. Of course she has. A moment later, a Threx figure stepped lightly over the root mesh, carrying a thin data wand and a pair of clear eye shields that shimmered slightly in the filtered light. She was smaller than Virilax by a full meter, with a more rounded cranial ridge and a robe stitched with fiber patterns that looked almost floral. Human Paul, she said, voice melodic and clipped. I am Vetra. I request observational access to your behavioral routine. Paul blinked. You're asking to follow me around? Affirmative. No speech alteration required. No feeding schedule disruptions. Observation only. Reeves stood. I'll leave you to it. Paul narrowed his eyes at him. That's not ominous at all. Reeves grinned and vanished behind the foliage. Vetra remained still, her hands folded over the wand. I will stand no closer than 1.2 meters. I will not interfere unless instructed. I have translated canine behavioral guides for reference, but many are contradictory. You're not wrong, Paul muttered, rubbing his good shoulder. All right, but Max doesn't do tricks. And if you try to scan him without asking, he'll probably pee on your boots. I do not wear boots. He'll find something. Vetra tilted her head and began recording. They spent the next 2 hours walking through the station's maintenance corridors. Paul needed the movement to keep his legs from cramping, and Max liked the different smells in each junction. Vetra trailed them, occasionally muttering notes into her wand. Your companion sniffs each threshold before proceeding, she noted at one point. He's checking for changes. New scents. Maybe stress pheromones. Canine olfaction is superior to our own. Does this make him the leader? Paul laughed. Only if I'm carrying snacks. She paused. That was not covered in the guides. Later, they stopped near an access hatch where a coolant pipe had started to leak, a minor issue, but one Paul could still help diagnose with his left hand and a diagnostic panel. He crouched slowly, fingers tapping at the interface while Max lay down beside the wall. What is his role during your labor? He waits. Does he grow impatient? He watches. If I get too quiet for too long, he checks on me. Vetra stepped closer, watching Max with sharp eyes. He is not bound to you with any synthetics. No neural tether. No verbal override. Nope. But he stays. Paul didn't look up. Yeah. He stays. That evening they returned to the habitat wing. Vetra asked to remain outside during Paul's rest cycle, and he agreed under the condition that she not record audio through the walls. He lay in bed, shoulder stiff, and stared at the ceiling. Max curled up in the corner, breathing slow and even. Paul exhaled, feeling the long day begin to settle into his bones. By the following morning, Vetra had compiled over 17 pages of notes. You documented his tail wag frequency? Paul asked over breakfast. It correlates with vocal intonation and rhythmic gestures. I am attempting to model emotional spikes based on tail oscillation. That's the nerdiest sentence I've ever heard about a dog. I take that as praise. After breakfast, Vetra followed them to the station's open exercise field, a long, slightly curved area lined with synthetic grass and low-gravity treadmills. Paul let Max off the leash, watching as he trotted ahead, nose low. Vetra crouched nearby, wand raised. Would your companion defend you from a predator? He lunged at a vacuum drone once. Does that count? Possibly. Max returned with a discarded flex ball in his mouth and dropped it at Paul's feet. I did not witness you command this action, Vetra said. He doesn't need a command. He knows I'll throw it. Based on mutual pattern recognition? Based on trust. Vetra paused. I do not possess a direct analog for that term. Paul picked up the ball and winced as the motion tugged at his shoulder. It's when you expect someone not to hurt you even when they could. Vetra didn't speak for a long moment. Then she said, I believe I have seen enough. Back in the greenhouse dome, she stood in front of Paul, data wand now deactivated. Your species' capacity for non-verbal emotional fidelity is not a fluke. Paul tilted his head. Is that a compliment? It is a hypothesis confirmed through observation. Max nudged her leg gently. She froze, then extended one hand. Max sniffed it once, then licked her palm. I will include this in my report, she said, blinking slowly. Paul stood, stretching his legs. So that's it? Yes. My assignment is complete. You may resume your routines without intrusion. She turned to leave, then hesitated. Would your companion accept a parting gift? I acquired a protein-based chew stick from the leisure market. Paul nodded. He'll appreciate that more than your 17 pages. Vetra knelt and offered the treat. Max took it delicately, tail swaying. Later that evening, Paul received a final message from the Dominion Council. The incident report had been officially closed. No further documentation or appearances were required. His ship, fully repaired and restocked, was cleared for departure at his discretion. He sat on the floor beside Max, one hand resting on the dog's back. Well, he said quietly, we didn't blow anything up. That's a win. Max thumped his tail once. Paul leaned back against the wall, the soft hum of the station settling into the background. Let's go home tomorrow. Max blinked slowly, content. And for the first time in over a week, Paul felt like the galaxy made just a little more sense.